Hi Year 11. So this week, obviously, we're going to be doing online learning. So in order to make sure that you're keeping up this week, you need to make sure that you're listening to these narrated PowerPoints and doing any tasks that you're asked to do. This slide simply shows us what we have looked at so far in our revision schedule. So we've looked at the Treaty of Versailles, Germany under the Kaiser, and we've looked at two little health topics of surgery and causes and treatments. This is the plan for the next half term. As you can see highlighted there, the top 2 weeks, we're going to be moving on to our second conflict and tension topic. We're going to be looking at the League of the Nations. So for our remote learning, as you can see there, the lessons that are numbered, we're going to be doing the knowledge. We're going to be doing some exam plans for the second 2 lessons, and we're going to be making sure that we're prepared for a League of Nations short answer test, which we'll be doing in the first lesson back next week. So you do need to make sure that you do this work that we're going through today. After that, we're going to do some more Germany topics, and then we're going to do a bit more health and a bit more conflict. That's the plan for this entire half term. So for the next 2 weeks, all we're looking at is the League of Nations. Before we make a start, perhaps pause this and have a think about what you can remember about the League of Nations. Can you remember anything about its aims? What was it trying to achieve? Can you remember anything about its powers or the sanctions that it had over countries who broke the rules? Anything about the structure, the assembly, the council, for example? Anything that was really good about it, the strengths of the League of Nations, either in the 1920s or the 1930s, or the weaknesses, the underlying things that eventually made it fail? And can you remember anything about the really specific incidents in both Manchuria and Abyssinia? Pause this, have a think. As usual, when we start a new revision topic, what we're going to begin with is we're going to start by looking at the actual knowledge of the topic. So what we'd like you to do as you're listening to this or as you're watching this is we'd like you please to make sure that you are making notes of some kind. If you have the ability to print, well, the knowledge sheets are attached to the Show My Homework section, and they're also attached on Student SharePoint. So please print that off and do the highlighting as normal. You could also download the sheets and highlight electronically. Or finally, if you don't have the ability to do that, you could simply on a piece of paper jot down the most important points about the membership as we go through. So let's make a start. We're going to begin with the membership of the League. The membership of the League was really important. In order to make the League work, they needed to make sure that they had the very best members. When the League was first set up, they had 42 countries. Now, this was a reasonable number of countries at the time, but of course it was by no means all the countries of the world. There were well over 100, 150 countries at this point, but 42 was a decent place to start. And the countries who joined to start with, Britain, France, Japan, Italy, those countries, they were world powers. They were countries who did have influence and sway, particularly Britain and France. But the really, really big problem from the very, very beginning was the fact that America refused to join the League. This completely undermined the League, of course, because the League was America's ideas. It was Woodrow Wilson's baby. It was the big thing that he wanted to get put into the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the reason why they rejected this is because many, many Americans decided that, the First World War had been a mistake and that America should not have got involved in that. And they didn't want to get entangled in more wars in the future. They didn't want to get involved in wars that involved Europe. They saw Europe as being old-fashioned, as backwards, and full of old resentments that they shouldn't be getting involved with. You also had an awfully large German immigrant population in the United States. They had a large population there, just like there were lots of people from Britain, from Ireland, from Italy, people all over the world, but a large German population, and they hated the Treaty of Versailles. And they associated the League of Nations, of course, with the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson had been defeated, and under the new president, President Harding, America began a new period. It was about America looking forward. It was about them becoming richer, becoming the world's leading power in terms of industrialization, for example, and trade. And they entered this period of isolation or isolationism. They never joined the League of Nations. And of course, the problem here was it undermined the League from the very, very beginning. So that's one big important country outside of the League. The second big important country outside of the League was Germany. Now, this again was a crucial mistake of the League of Nations. In not allowing Germany to join, the League was viewed from the very beginning as a winners' club. Surely the country who was seen to have caused World War I should be in the League of Nations if it was going to stop future wars. They did join for a number of years in the late 1920s and early 1930s, but when Hitler came to power, he left the League, saying that Germany were not being treated as equals. The third massive power that they didn't have was the USSR, or Russia, Soviet Russia as it was at this point. And they didn't join until after the Germans had left in 1934, and that's because they were really worried and they needed that collective security of being part of this big organisation. They were not seen to be welcome in the early days because they had that communist system of government which was so different to the other members, and other countries saw them as being suspicious. And they eventually were expelled in 1939 when Stalin, after the Nazi-Soviet pact, invaded Finland. The League did expand over time. By 1934, it had amassed 58 members. This was obviously an improvement on what had come before, but it still meant that more countries were not a member than were. And the big problem was that many of the leading countries weren't there. So the final point here, the number of nations gave the League some authority, but it was the strength and resolve of its leading members which determined its power. So everything hinged on these four countries, on Britain, on France, and Japan, and Italy. And as we hopefully know, those countries were not always as committed as they should have been. So we can see that from the very beginning, the membership was a bit of a problem. Another issue from the very beginning was its aims. The aims of the League of Nations were very, very ambitious, and for some, this was another reason for its failure. So one of the things that you'll come across when we're talking about the League of Nations is something called the Covenant. The Covenant was the rules of the League of Nations. So the first 26 points of the Treaty of Versailles formed this covenant. These laid down the aims and rules of what was going to happen and how the organisation was going to work. When we're thinking about the aims, what it was that it actually wanted to achieve, we think of the acronym SIDE, and this helps us remember. The most important aim of the League of Nations, of course, was to stop war. That is why it had been set up in the first place. That was the whole point of why Woodrow Wilson wanted an organisation like this, to make sure the horrors of World War I could not happen again. But it also wanted to do other things, improve the quality of life. That was where it did its good works in things like the International Labour Organization, refugees, slavery, all of that kind of stuff. Linked to the first aim of stopping war was that encouragement that all the members of the League would work towards disarmament to make sure that war could not happen in the future. The final part, which is possibly the most controversial part of the League of Nations, was it was also there to enforce the Treaty of Versailles, make sure that countries were not invading or taking over boundaries that had been set in that treaty, and also to encourage cooperation between countries. That is what Woodrow Wilson had hoped would happen with the League of Nations. All countries had to sign this agreement, this covenant, and agree to stick to those rules, or they would face some of the sanctions or powers of the League. So I said a moment ago that some people said that the League of Nations, these original aims were too ambitious. And part of that is, had they just wanted to disarm and stop war, potentially it could have been more successful. The fact that it took on loads of other works meant it had a lot to do for a brand new organisation. Another important part of the League of Nations was how it was organised, how it was set up, how it actually ran and how it actually worked. So the main part of the League of Nations was the Assembly. An assembly was where everybody gathered, and this was met up once per year. So this wasn't something that met up regularly. The biggest problem with this part of the organisation was that all decisions had to be based on unanimous vote. Well, sometimes that wasn't very difficult, because if it was, do we let a new country join us? That was often easy because other members of the League would be welcoming to those new countries. It might be about budget and how much each country has to pay, and that would be divided as fairly as possible, the richer countries paying more. So that didn't tend to be so controversial. But some decisions could be difficult. And even the simplest decisions, if it's got to be unanimous, everybody agrees, it doesn't always work. In order to deal with crises and problems that cropped up, a council was set up. Now, those permanent members, it started off as 4 permanent members, Britain, France, Italy and Japan, those main members of the League, and then Germany once they had joined in 1926. In a crisis, they got together, decided what to happen. Each member could have a veto. In other words, they could overrule a decision made by the others. The group only met in emergencies. So some years they might meet frequently if there was lots of emergencies cropping up, other years not so much. But the council was one that was so essential to the smooth running of the League of Nations. If the council dealt with the crises effectively and swiftly, then the League of Nations would be effective. Another really important part of the League was the Secretariat. This is the bit that did all the paperwork, the administration. So this group was vital to the smooth running of the group. A massive problem with the Secretariat is that it was understaffed. Well, it was having to track millions of missing people after the war. It was trying to do all of that work in terms of the labour organisation, all of that stuff. They couldn't do it all. And what that meant was when there was a crisis and the council was having to make decisions, the League acted incredibly slowly. And we're going to see how that caused problems later on. The League also had these special agencies or departments, and these actually did lots and lots of really good work. So you had things like the Court of International Justice. They did really good work in deciding how to make sure that shipping lanes were being run fairly and the trade was going well between people, minorities in different countries were being looked after. There was an international labour organisation. They tried to make sure that people were being restricted to less long working days and try and restrict to a 48-hour working week. You also had a health committee who were working on things like leprosy and diseases that could now be wiped out with modern medicine. You had refugees committees who were looking after war victims, and slavery, who were attacking slave traders all over the world. And you had those mandates, which were those countries which had been taken off Germany at the end of World War I and were now being administered or looked after by Britain and France. The powers of the League were incredibly important. If the League was going to be successful in stopping war, it was going to have to make sure that it gave really strong action against those who broke the rules. So what they had was these sanctions in order to deal with countries who were aggressive or were trying to invade others. And these worked in a stepped up fashion, so they became more serious as they went along. So the first thing that you could do to punish a country or to try and bring them round and try and stop doing whatever it was they were doing that was breaking the rules, is you could tell them off, give them moral sanctions. So this was saying, we don't like your behaviour, and we're telling you that as a collective group, the League of Nations is asking you to stop. Get out of that country, give that back, stop that behaviour. If that didn't work, the next phase was on economic sanctions. So this was where members of the League would collectively stop trading with any country that had broken the rules. And of course, that can be quite a powerful sanction, because if you've got 42 countries or even 58 countries by the 1930s who are saying, we're no longer going to trade with you, that could actually be pretty damaging to a country's economy, especially because you did have big economies like Britain and France involved in that. And finally, if the country they'd used moral sanctions, they'd used economic sanctions, and a country was still breaking the rules, of course, the League could use physical force. As we know, the League did not have an army of its own, but the countries who were part of the League could lend their armies to the League to help them use physical force against those who were breaking the rules. We often break the League down into two different periods. The first period being the 1920s, the second being the 1930s. And the reason we do that is because in the 1920s, the League tended to have a number of real successes. And there was actually quite a lot of hope that this organisation may actually help keep some countries from going to war with others. So there's a number of successes, some of them involved in peacekeeping, some of them not, for the 1920s. Now, one of the first successes was in 1920, Finland and Sweden had argued about who owned these islands which were between Finland and Sweden, the Åland Islands. Both countries wanted those islands and they were getting close to going to war, but they took their argument to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations said, actually, Finland has more right to those islands, and both of them accepted that decision. There was no war. This was a big success for the League. In 1921, there was also a bit of a dispute over Upper Silesia. This was an area of land that had been a bit contentious between Germany and Poland. So Upper Silesia, the Germans wanted it, had lots of industries, the Poles wanted it. had lots of farming and industry. It was going to be really important to both countries. It had a bit of a mixed population as well, some Germans, some Poles. So what the League this time decided to do to avoid war in that particular area in 1921 was they decided to hold a plebiscite or a vote. Who did Upper Silesia want to join? Did they want to be Polish or did they want to be German? What actually happened, it was very, very clear in the vote that the industrial parts of that area wanted to join Germany, and the rural or countryside areas, the more farming communities, they wanted to join Poland. So Upper Silesia was split, with the bits that had voted to join Poland going to Poland, and the bits that had voted to join Germany joining Germany. This again was a success. The League was listening to the people. There was another incident between Greece and Bulgaria in 1925 where the Greeks invaded part of Bulgaria, and yet again, this was a success. The Greeks listened. They did as the League was told. The League also got 400,000 prisoners of war returned home. They helped lots and lots of Turkish refugees return to their homeland. This is all following World War I. They closed down Swiss drug traders, and they attacked slave owners in places like Burma in Asia and Sierra Leone in Africa. This was a big, big success. So it looked like the League was actually, in terms of peacemaking, being successful, and in terms of other works as well. However, there were a number of big failures as well. In 1921, the Poles invaded Vilna. This was the capital of Lithuania. It had a little bit of a mixed population. There was definitely a greater Lithuanian population, but there was an awful lot of Poles living there too. So the Poles invaded that area believing that they had the right to it. The League ordered Poland to leave, but they refused, and the League did nothing. This undermined the League at this very, very early stage because Poland were not a massively difficult or powerful nation, and they should have done more to stop them. A more serious incident was in 1923. This was where Mussolini had bombarded the Greek island of Corfu following disagreement, and the Italians were completely out of order in bombing and bombarding Corfu, and yet they refused to abide by the League's decision. The Italians were told to pay compensation, they were told to stop the bombardment, they refused, and in the end, the Greeks had to pay money to Italy. This was one of the League's very, very important powers, Italy, undermining and disobeying the League. One of the League's other aims, if you remember, was disarmament. But they failed throughout the whole 1920s. There was lots of positive discussions, but by the end of the decade, there was no real agreement on what should happen. And there was no agreement about reaching a 48-hour week across the world and across those countries that were members of the League of Nations. So yes, some really good successes, some worrying failures that perhaps showed that when the League was being challenged by more powerful countries and when countries refused to listen to the League, they did very little. So as I mentioned on the last slide, we often break it down into the 1920s and 1930s. And the reason for that more than anything is because of what changes at the end of 1929. In October 1929, we have the Wall Street crash, which leads on, of course, to the worldwide Great Depression. And the Great Depression had a massive impact on the whole world, of course, and on the League members, and particularly on countries who relied on trade. Countries like Japan. It made them desperate. It also meant that economic sanctions weren't as powerful as they once had been because world trade had dropped massively already. So what we get in the 1930s are two big incidents that essentially finish off the League of Nations and show that they do not take their peacemaking seriously, and certainly the main members of the League didn't take their role as seriously as they should. So the first incident that we need to understand is what happened in Manchuria in 1931. So in September 1931, Japan blamed the Chinese for sabotage on the Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway. They invaded Manchuria. They said that this was a hostile act by the Chinese, and therefore, in response and to protect their economic interests in Manchuria, they needed to take over that area. And they set up the Japanese-controlled state of Manchukuo. So they renamed the province. And they put the former emperor of China, Henry Puyi, in charge of the place. China relatively swiftly appealed to the League of Nations. This was Japan, one of the main members of the League of Nations, one of the members of the League Council, directly breaking the covenant, the rules of the League of Nations, and therefore the League should be acting swiftly and decisively to end the incident. Well, the League sent in December, so 2 months after the Chinese appeal, they sent a commission to go and investigate what was going on in Manchuria under this guy called Lord Lytton. Well, it took him until April 1932 to actually reach Manchuria. So the incident happened in September. He doesn't arrive until April. Well, that's 7 months after the original incident. It's 6 months after the report has reached the League of Nations. And he didn't make his report, didn't finally publish it until October of 1932. That is a full year after the League had been appealed to, and a full 13 months after the original incident. That is not swift action. In the meantime, before Lord Lytton even arrived in China, the Japanese attacked and conquered Shanghai. The League said, no, this can't go on. There needs to be a ceasefire in this area. The Chinese said, of course there can be, but the Japanese just continued their invasion and continued to attack. Lytton's report very, very clearly stated that Japan were the aggressor and they should leave. That was very, very clear at this stage. And that had taken them a year to put together. Finally, because the Assembly didn't meet until February of the next year, so February 1933, so we're now talking about another 4 months on. So we're now talking about 17, 18 months after the original incident. The Assembly voted that Japan should return Manchuria. The Japanese walked out of the meeting. The League could agree no economic sanctions or even ban an arms sale, so stop selling weapons to them. Therefore, nothing happened. The League could not agree to take any further action. They had used moral sanctions by telling the Japanese that they were wrong, that their behaviour was condemned by the League of Nations, and yet they didn't take any further action whatsoever. The Japanese then resigned from the League and they invaded the next territory to Manchuria, known as Johor. What this meant was that the League had been completely undermined. It revealed the weaknesses of the League and encouraged others, as we're going to see in the next incident, to break the rules, knowing there was going to be very little punishment. Japan had tested the League and the League had failed. Our second major incident happened in Abyssinia. So in December 1934, there was a fight between Abyssinian and Italian soldiers at a watering hole in the desert, a place called Walwal. What you got at this point was 100 Abyssinian soldiers had been killed, 30 Italians had been killed, and they were arguing about who this territory was, because the Italians had some colonies in this area, and of course it was right next to Abyssinian territory. Mussolini said that the Italians had been threatened and he prepared to invade over this incident. He said that the Abyssinians were totally out of order. Just like within the Manchurian incident, the League of Nations set up a commission. But notice again, that this was not as swift as it could be. It took 2 months for a commission to actually be set up. And again, it took a long time for a report to be made. This time, not quite as long as the last incident, but it was still 9 months after the incident. It suggested that part of Abyssinia was given to Italy as compensation. Mussolini decided that he could get more, so he rejected the plan and invaded Abyssinia in October 1935. So the report had come out in September. He decided that because the League was looking weak and saying that he could have some of that territory, he should try and go further. So the League of Nations at this point did bring in some limited economic sanctions. They banned sales of arms to Italy and they put sanctions on rubber and metal. All of this actually didn't do a massive amount of damage to Italy. It did, however, do some damage to Abyssinia. Crucially, what the League of Nations didn't do was close the Suez Canal or ban oil or coal sales, which would have massively harmed the Italian economy. Now, the Suez Canal was jointly owned by the French and the British. These were the two major countries in the League of Nations. Had they closed the Suez Canal, it would have made it incredibly difficult for Mussolini to get his troops to Abyssinia in order to launch a full-scale invasion. By having that open, they actually made it really, really easy for him. So in the background, there was lots of negotiations going on. In December 1935, news leaked out about the Hall of Vow Pact. This was a pact by Britain and France to give most of Abyssinia to Italy. They weren't particularly bothered about Abyssinia, and they decided that they wanted Italy as an ally. They were getting a little bit worried about the power that was being built up by Hitler in the centre of Europe, and therefore they decided that rather than having Mussolini then fall into the arms of Hitler if they treated him badly, if they kept him as an ally, that actually that was going to do them good in the long term. Now, this never went ahead because the British and the French public were really against giving Abyssinia to Italy. They wanted their countries to stand up to this aggression. But it damaged the reputation of the League because the two major members of the League of Nations that were left, because remember, Japan have now left, the Germans have left, and the Italians are here breaking the rules. Everything is in the hands of Britain and France. So the reputation of the League is damaged by the Hall of Vow Pact because the two countries that are left are not working within the League of Nations, they're plotting behind its back. And it convinced Mussolini that Britain and France were not serious about defending Abyssinia, and he was right. And it made him go, well, I can invade anyway, I can take it over and nothing will happen. So by the middle of the next year, he completed his conquest, he'd taken over the whole of the country and completely got away with it. The next month, Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Abyssinia, went to the League of Nations in Geneva in Switzerland, and he was completely ignored. The League took no further actions. All they had done is those limited economic sanctions which had not worked and plotted behind the back of the League itself, the leading countries. So what this showed was, again, the slowness of the League, the powerlessness of the League, and the ineffectiveness of the League. At this point, Britain and France just decided we don't really want to use the League anymore, and they moved towards a policy of appeasement. 9 countries left the League in quick succession following this incident. This was a disaster, and it's really seen to be the thing that killed off the League of Nations. One of the big things that you need to know about is, well, why did it collapse then? Why did the League of Nations not survive the 1930s? Well, it was always associated, of course, with the Treaty of Versailles. And that meant it had a bad reputation from the very beginning. It was undermined by many, many countries not liking what had happened with the Treaty of Versailles. Its aims, as I mentioned at the very, very beginning, were too ambitious. Perhaps this should have been the one and only aim of the early League of Nations. And maybe the other good works could have been something they added on if the League of Nations was able to manage in the 1920s. The organisation, of course, remember what I talked about earlier, the Secretariat being very, very understaffed, made it muddled and slow. The fact that you had to have unanimous decisions, or in the Council, countries could veto decisions. The powers that the League of Nations had, well, it looked like they were quite good. You had that upscaling of sanctions from moral to economic, finally into those military sanctions. But actually, in reality, the only power they had was moral, the power to tell off. Sanctions had been proven not to work. It had proven to be powerless. Not having an army massively undermined it. Countries weren't scared of it. And you had countries, as we're particularly seeing there, we know, of course, in the 1930s that Hitler's going to break the Treaty of Versailles lots of times, and the League does nothing about it. We also know that its own members, Italy and Japan, defied the League of Nations. But really importantly as well, it wasn't just the countries that broke the rules, it was the fact that other countries let it down. America never joined the League of Nations. They have to take a part in the blame for it failing. Of course, Germany, Italy and Japan left it, and Britain and France betrayed it. They were too worried about their own interests, their own empire, their own trade, to actually really invest. And as time went on, it failed again, and people moved further and further away from it. Many historians would argue that actually it was doomed from the start. So what do we need you to do now? What you need to do is you need to prepare for the short answer test. That's going to be prepared in lesson 1 next week. So that again, it's attached, it's on Student SharePoint in the folder. It's also attached to Show My Homework. You need to make sure that you are ready to pass that test. It's only on that information that we've gone through today. It's not a big short answer test at all. Please make sure you're aiming for that 100%. And based on what we've done today, it's taken about half an hour for me to talk you through this. Use the rest of this period to make sure that you are making some revision materials. Do a mind map, make some flashcards, revision clock, make sure you've highlighted and added to the notes that you've already got. It's important that you do something with this now that we've gone through the information together. Good luck with it all. Please make sure you contact myself, Miss Monroe or Miss Bowden if you need any help.